So we're going to be moving to the next panel. So just in terms of tracking, what we're doing here is moving from, again, these individual stories, with the caveat that Anne-Marie so I think compellingly reminded us of, to what the data is telling us. Why are we not there yet? What's going on? And then moving us into a forward-looking perspective. And then we're now moving into the third panel. And in that regard, I'm very happy to introduce Alain Babineau, who's going to be chairing and moderating the final session. Alain is a retired RCMP officer. He holds a JD and BCL from McGill University, and he has 30 years in law enforcement, including stints with the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, and the Canadian Military Police. He retired as a staff sergeant from the RCMP in 2016. And also holds a degree of social sciences and criminology from the University of Ottawa. And he's currently acting as an independent advisor and consultant in Montreal. And I'd like to take a moment to thank Alain for his input and support throughout this conference. So Alain, over to you to introduce our first speaker and to welcome all the speakers on panel 3 to this conference.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Professor Iliadis. I'm so proud to be part of this panel discussion, and I was so honored when Professor Iliadis focused on racial profiling and assist with finding some of the panelists. It's often been ascribed to Einstein that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. When I look at the issue of racial profiling, I'm afraid it's been the case for decades. We failed to stop the practice of racial profiling, and it continues to have serious consequences for Blacks, Indigenous, and some other racialized minorities. And so racial profiling is arguably one of the most highly contested topics of conversation in criminal justice today. Right. During my 30 years in policing, I paid attention to communities which has statistically a higher crime rate. However, over the last 5 years, I've been focusing specifically on the issue of racial profiling by the police. I'm particularly proud of having been an advisor to Foniemi and the team at CRAR, which, by the way, I think, from my experience, is the only NGO in this country that has meaningfully advocated for racial profiling. During my time in that capacity, I've come to realize that not only racial profiling delegitimized what I consider to be a noble and honored profession, policing, but I've also seen its ravages in our community firsthand. I mean, I don't usually get too personal on these things, but 2 days ago, my son got racially profiled, and I've been reeling over this ever since. So the previous panel highlighted key aspect of the obstacle to progress, right? So the Honorable Marlene Jennings' extensive experience in police oversight show that the need to continue pressures to achieve accountability is there. And she's demonstrated that she knows how to apply pressure. Dr. Scott Wortley's research demonstrates repeated studies and surveys over the decades showing huge disparities in how police target different ethnic groups with reports starting from the mid-1990s. And despite various attempts to address the issues, there's been very little to no change, actually. A couple of years ago, just after I finished reading his Halifax report on Street Check, I actually bumped into Scott during an Ontario human rights case on racial profiling, where he was providing expert evidence. And I told him at the time, I said, I need to get you in Montreal to do the same kind of research. Well, you're not here to do a research today, but I'm so glad you're part of this panel. Dr. Anne-Marie Livingstone has shown policies have been established to legitimize illegal form of racism, and has illustrated a broader perspective that positions police relation in relation to colonialism and the settler state. While Anne-Marie and I have collegially agreed to disagree on some of the issues regarding racial profiling, I believe that the report that she co-authored entitled Montreal sans profilage is one of the best qualitative research on racial profiling I've ever read. And so I was adamant that we needed to have her on this panel. So I'm very thankful that she's part of this. Dr. Kanika Samuels-Wortley discussed avenues to transform our understanding of racial profiling to a Black-centered approach, noting that the reason why racial profiling is still an issue is that system and institution do not allow to address the fact that racism is still an issue. The idea of centering race specifically goes to the question of who experiences racism. Bearing in mind these historical realities, this panel now shifts its focus to the solutions going forward. Monitoring, meaningful accountability, and organizational change are among of the key steps to addressing racial profiling and respecting equality rights. We need internal organization strategies, good data, and the courage to ask the hard question. For instance, how can law enforcement can both serve and protect all citizens equally? How can communities engage as equal partners to combat racial profiling effectively? So I'm going to be borrowing from Baldwin, the Fire Next Time here, and I'm suggesting that it's all up to us now as a society, the relatively conscious citizens, and the relatively conscious law enforcement professionals, to end the nightmare of racial profiling has caused for so many. And as reading, Dr. King also said that now it's time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. Folks, while we can't regulate, we can regulate behavior, and we can also sanction misbehavior, we cannot legislate goodwill. Well, for this panel discussion, we wanted to bring together community activists, a police administrator, Human Rights Commission leadership, and victorious citizens, all working for very different perspectives, because we can no longer afford to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. Folks, as we say in English, quand on veut, on peut, et quand on peut, on doit. Or in French, where there's a will, there's got to be a way. So on that note, I would like to introduce our panelists. First of all, Felipe Panderites, the president of the Quebec Human Rights and Youth Rights Commission. The floor is yours, Mr. Tessier. I think you're muted.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Babineau. Thanks, everyone. Happy to be here with you. Just to start, I just want to wish to acknowledge the very powerful testimonies that we heard today. I think I want to also salute the necessary involvement of people like Mr. de Bellefeuille, who has gone through a number of proceedings to ultimately have his rights being recognized by the Human Rights Tribunal of Quebec. It takes a lot of resilience, a lot of courage, a lot of endurance, and a lot of patience to go through that. And I just want to start by saluting that and saluting Mr. Bellefeuille for his collaboration and participation in that matter. Just to take a step back, and I do not also have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to refer to some of the materials that I've prepared. Just of note, apologies in advance if I refer to French terms, but I'm a Francophone, and a lot of the materials I'm reading from are in French. So for you who are listening in and do not understand, apologies in advance for that. So for starters, just to wish to come back a bit in time. And I think that Marlene Jennings did a superb job of talking about her own experience. But from the point of view of our commission, we have to go back. If we're going to look at the Quebec context, there is something very important for the commission here, which is in 1987, the Anthony Griffin death at the hands of the police. That led to a committee being put in place by the Human Rights Commission that led to ultimately the creation of what is now the deontology commissioner in ethics, police ethics commissioner in Quebec as we know it today. And that report at the time, or 1987, had confirmed, and I'm quoting, confirmed the allegations of discriminatory behavior and racist behaviors from the police force. So we're in 1987 here. Fast forward, because as Madam Jennings mentioned, these notions of racial profiling then started to become more and more common in language. It started to be more and more used by the RCMP in the 90s. And obviously that in turn came across the Human Rights Commission across Canada. And in Quebec per se, we're talking about early 2000. 2003, our commission started receiving and accepting such complaints for racial profiling. So it is not a term which has been coined that has such a long history. It's fairly recent if you look in terms of pure history. And the steps that were then taken are very important for what we're doing today. There was reference to the Bombardier case before the Supreme Court, where the definition that was put in place by my colleague, Maître Michel Turenne, who is with us today. Bonjour, Michel. Just to in 2005, and that definition of racial profiling that was put in place or put forward by the commission here then was adopted by various police forces and government bodies in Quebec, and ultimately by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2015. So very quick evolution in terms of legal evolution. 15 years is not a whole lot of time for the judicial system to adapt itself to this situation. The other thing also that's very important for our commission is that in 2009, because of these, because of this work that was being done, and because of all the civil society groups that were working and putting these issues forwards, and these revendications for more action on that front, the commission launched a consultation for a public consultation for racial profiling, its consequences, and among youth. So there was a consultation during a 2-year period and a report that was issued in 2011. And in that report, there was a lot of recommendations that were made forward. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about here today, data collection, so the systemic approach to these problems, all of these things, and I won't go through in details the many recommendations that were put forward, but just so you know that since 2011, that report is there, and the commission actually reviewed the implementation of that report last fall. So last fall in 2020, we launched that review, and we put forward a summary. It's in English and it's on our website. So you can actually go on our website at cdpdj.qc.ca and download it. And so the summary is in English. Unfortunately, the report for you who do not master the French language is only in French, but the summary is there and it's available, and it's a good summary of what our findings were. And just so that we're clear about what went on in that report is, not only was it the goal of that report was to take stock on how the various stakeholders have implemented our recommendations as a Human Rights Commission, but also highlight the impacts of racial profiling and the systemic discrimination, and the importance of taking concrete and systemic action to address these issues. So one of the key things also in that report, and that the approach that was taken, is the fact that, and I highlight that because the testimony of the different panelists today highlights one of the objectives of that consultation was that to give a voice to the victims of these phenomena. So it was very important for the commission through that consultation and through the new report that we issued to give voice to the victims of racial profiling and its different manifestations. So we had focus groups across Quebec interviews with people. Also, all of that was gathered and taken into account for a report. So one of the things that I want to highlight also is the fact that in this report, we give a voice to youths. And just a couple of examples that or citations or that were given. So I'm quoting here for a participant is saying, the first thing that security guards think right away when they see a person of color is, I need backup. Or as soon as there are two Black people somewhere, they say, there's a problem, there's a danger. We feel that impression hasn't changed. So a lot of the report and all of the documentation that was put forward also is in line with what was mentioned before by the other panelists. And if I may again quote Professor Myrna Lashley, who's involved in the report, talking about what we're talking about systemic discrimination here. She says it's not just a police problem. It's a problem in the society, certainly in the government structures, and people don't always understand what is meant by systemic discrimination. People think if I don't call you the N-word, I don't slap a woman alongside the head, that's not discrimination. They think it's personal. These policies, they're not policies put in place that were so blatant. They're not blatant. There are things such as, how accessible are you? What jobs do people get? Who holds the power? So as Professor Lashley mentions, a lot of these issues that are involved here and are put forward in our report highlight the fact that the voices of the victims here need to be highlighted. And I want to salute again the panel today for doing that. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I was talking about the evolution in that report, and very recently, obviously, we've talked about the Bombardier matter in the Supreme Court, but you also heard about Mr. de Bellefeuille's case, so I won't talk about that one. He spoke about it very eloquently, so I won't go back on that, except to say that there was a very specific recognition in that Human Rights Tribunal of Quebec decision of the systemic nature of racial profiling and of the need for systemic remedies such as data collection and actual police force training with follow-up and evaluations. So there was that decision is very important on the personal side of Mr. de Bellefeuille, but also from a systemic perspective. That decision will have an impact on the way that police force have to behave and conduct themselves as per racial profiling in the future. And another very important decision that was just rendered by the Human Rights Tribunal was in the Niembwe case in the Gatineau. The city of Gatineau appealed the decision, but the Court of Appeal just very recently maintained the decision of, chose not to hear the appeal. So the decision of the Human Rights Tribunal is now final. And that decision was very also important in mentioning and highlighting, again, the systemic nature of the problem and issuing recommendations to the city of Gatineau. And I just want to mention that one of the topics that has made a lot of noise in Montreal in the last year or so has been the report that was issued by the SPVM themselves on the data about street checks, the Assaoui Moulonnet report. And that report actually is quoted in the decision of the Human Rights Tribunal, and the Human Rights Tribunals asked that the city of Gatineau have its police force read the report so that the actual police, and I remember one of the panelists was mentioning, hopefully people are listening in to what we're saying today, but here the tribunal, the HRT has actually issued an order to say, police force of Gatineau, you need to read this report because you need to have, as Professor Wortley mentioned, you need to see that data. You need to see those facts so that this does not come into the form of intuition or emotion, but you're talking about the rational side of things. We're saying this is a statistical thing. It exists. It is not only a perception. It is a reality, a very concrete reality, and you need to understand it through hard facts and hard numbers that no one can contradict and contest. So that was also very important in the Gatineau decision that was rendered in that these remedies that are being asked for or being ordered by the courts to be put in place by the police forces will have, we hope as a commission, actually have an impact on how these police officers view their work, view themselves, and view their conduct with racialized people. So that's also something very important that I wanted to mention. Alain, I don't know how much time I have left, sorry. 3? Okay, time goes fast. Okay, another thing I just wanted to mention also is that a lot of the work that has been done here at the commission always has been, as some of you know our commission better, on 2 fronts. So there's that legal front. We talked about these cases that are being brought before the Human Rights Tribunal, the fact that we hear these, we deal with these complaints for racial profiling and bring them before the HRT. But there's also the other side, which I mentioned about, I talked about, which is these studies and reports and recommendations that we make to different bodies, such as right now there's in Quebec a review of the Police Act. And I want to mention this because there's something important again, because in that revision of the Police Act, it is explicitly mentioned that one of the things that the government wants the Police Act to reflect, or at least to take into account, is the notion of racial profile. So we've went from the creation of a definition and the recognition legally of that notion to a government report saying we need to review the Police Act of Quebec, taking into account that concept. So that shows again that these issues, that notion of racial profiling is now not only a legal term, it's also a political term, and it has gone into the process of making laws in Quebec. And that also that's something very important for the future. One last thing I want to mention about, I want to talk about, is that obviously what we're trying to do on our side is to talk a lot more about racism in Quebec. We've been doing that for the last year and a half or so, very, very, very proactively. So one of the things that we see is an increase in complaints here at the Human Rights Commission. So just to give you an idea, we've, in the last 5 years, 5 years ago, we had 21 files open here at the Human Rights Commission for racial profiling. Right now, we're at 76 per year. So that might not seem a huge number, but that's almost four times as much as 5 years ago, because that issue is out there in the public, because as a commission we're talking about it, because there's these judgments, because there's civil society awareness, there's all these groups and individuals that are more and more aware of their rights. And that's something very positive for us as a society, because then we can actually move on by addressing that systemic problem. Alain, hopefully I've managed to keep the time correctly, and thank you for your.
You did good. You did very good. Very good. Well, thank you very much. Just to sort of sum it up a little bit, I took some notes. I mean, obviously the Bellefeuille case and the Gatineau case both exemplify persistence on the part of the victims, or the victors, as I call them. I hate from victims. Persistence on the part of the victors. But justice delayed is denied, right? So in both cases, it took over 6 years for these cases to come to fruition. So it may speak to an issue of capacity. You've talked about the increase in number of files for the Human Rights Commission. So it's something that governments must really pay attention to, is the increase in capacity. Otherwise, there'll be folks that are going to be drop out. They're going to drop out of the school districts. And lastly, I must say that even though there's been some systemic suggestions and orders by the court, but there's going to have to be a follow-up, right? Who's going to be monitoring those police services to make sure that those changes are effected in a timely fashion without deliberate speed? Otherwise, it'll take a number of years for those things to come to fruition. So when it comes to police agency, I often say trust, but you must verify, because otherwise all of that will be for naught. So thank you very much, Mr. Tessier. Really appreciate it. Our next guest speaker is Nakusette, and she's the Executive Director of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal. So Nakusette, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to put everything in 20 minutes. We'll see how that works out. But I mean, I think it's important, and I think it was addressed in the introduction at the beginning of this conference about the tension between Indigenous people and police Canada-wide, right? So, you know, the fact that, you know, one of the first jobs of the RCMP was to, you know, shove Indigenous people onto reservations and not allowing them to leave. And then also later on, collecting the children from residential school or collecting them from their homes and bringing them to residential school. And then that if the parents tried to fight that, they would jail the parents. So we're talking a long time of tension between the police and Indigenous people. And, you know, here in Montreal, a lot of Indigenous people leave the communities because they try to have a better life. And they are faced with all different kinds of issues with the police. And I've been working at the Native Women's Shelter for 20 years, so, or more than 20 years. And, you know, I hear time and time again about the struggles that Indigenous people have, and even more those that are homeless and the struggles that they have with the police. So, you know, in 2015, you know, through the network, I signed an agreement with the SPVM so that we could have a better working relationship. And it had like 4 parts to it. So one of them was training. One of them was having a procedure on missing and murdered Indigenous women. It also had a prevention plan and a committee, right? So it would be a comité vigé autochtone. Basically, you know, we were told that we would create a committee where Indigenous people could sit around a table with police and then discuss different issues that were coming up on a monthly basis. And, you know, signing that agreement in 2015, I had these rose-colored lenses. I was thinking, oh, this is awesome. Everything's going to be great. And everything fell through very quickly. I mean, the first thing was the committee that was created. We were given misinformation. So we were told that we had to elect Indigenous people to sit at that table, turned into, you know, non-Indigenous people that work for an organization that has Indigenous people to sit at that table. And it's very hard for, you know, non-Indigenous people to share the extent of fear and intimidation that police can put towards an Indigenous person. So that was really difficult. And, you know, what happened with that committee is eventually there were more and more members. Now there's some kind of like, I don't know, almost clause or protocol that there has to be X amount of Indigenous people in order for a meeting to go forward. You know, after a while, you just stop going, you stop showing up. And that's difficult. If things are not going to change, then, you know, I'd rather put my time into something that actually will change. The training that we did with the SPVM was almost 2 years in creating, 2 years of presenting something to them and it being rejected. And then sort of at the last time we grouped together and presented to some police officers, it was later canceled the next day because apparently we were not qualified to do our own training. So that gets difficult. So you know, you try to like move forward and engage with the police and try to do steps to sort of mend that relationship. And then there's all these steps backwards. So, you know, I tried to do better with the protocol on missing and murdered Indigenous women by creating the Ishwe project. And there's been sort of bumps with that as well. But I think that is just the nature of working with the police, that you know, at least for Indigenous people, we know it's going to be hard. We still have to show up, but we have to kind of find our avenues on where we show up. And it's been pretty difficult. I think that, you know, especially those that are homeless, right, that are being racially profiled by the police, that their voices are muted. Because if they complain and then the police see them on the streets, then there's the possibility of payback, right? So there was an incident that happened at Cabot Square on May 3rd, where, you know, Cabot Square last year was the sort of homeless park where we had Resilience Montreal outside in the park with the homeless population, and a Cree woman sat down on the church steps across from Cabot Square and was in just total mental collapse. She was just, we have never seen her that bad. And David Chapman ended up sitting with her for 4 hours and having a conversation with her. And after 4 hours, she said, you know what, I think I'm ready for you to call me an ambulance. And what happened was, instead of an ambulance, which is what he asked for, we had 17 police officers show up in about 7 or 8 cars and a canine unit to deal with the situation, which put this woman into like fear, because she didn't understand why all these police officers were there. All she wanted was an ambulance. And there was a lot of negotiation between David and the police and trying to help this woman to actually give her the help she needs, not upset her, which is what happened. What's worse is this particular woman, this is not the first time that she has been targeted by the police. I had literally, I guess in 2016, had gone to see the police about a different issue that was never resolved. So what are we learning from this? That every time someone speaks up, that these things do not get resolved, and that they are almost tagged in the system as, you know, some kind of a dangerous person. I mean, she's clearly not dangerous. She was only dangerous to herself, and she needed the help. So, you know, I mean, Quebec Native Women was awesome because they were able to provide her with a lawyer to help her, and she put in a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. So that's pending. So we're waiting, and we really hope to see that she has her day in court. But, you know, you look at this May 3rd incident, and then you think, that's not so bad. You know why? Because a month later, Chantal Moore, who was, you know, in another community, a wellness check by the police. They arrived and they said that she had a knife, so they shot her to death. So, you know, the girl at Cabot Square survived, Chantal didn't. So I think that we see across Canada that there's this issue with policing, and there's also very little accountability, right? We're still waiting to hear what happened at Cabot Square. We're still waiting to hear what is going to be the results of that, of what happened with Chantal Moore. We know just recently with Colton Bouchy's mother that she was also treated very badly by the police when her son was murdered. And yet there's nothing actually happened. So I think that what we need to do is sort of keep fighting, because if we give up, nothing is going to happen. When that incident happened on May 3rd, I actually wrote a letter and I sent it to the police and to Valerie Plante, and I later had a meeting with Valerie Plante about it. And I also sent it to a couple of different people, like Ghislaine Picard. And, you know, I was very specific about what I wanted to see. And we are still waiting. So when I addressed this in writing, I asked that there is more, like a new sort of concrete measure by the police on how they're going to deal with mental health issues when an Indigenous person calls for 911. And we also asked about, you know, the report that came out in 2019 about Indigenous women being 11 times more likely to be racial profiled. We were like, you want to address that? Because it's 2021 and you haven't said anything. So it's time for you to do something. Still waiting. So, you know, these are really difficult things that we continue to address, and we keep having to speak up, right? I mean, the AFNQL chiefs and I had a discussion this summer with Mark Miller to also talk about the different policings and asked if we could be part of the solution and help with training all police officers, right? Because all those trainings for, you know, the cultural training for the police, those have stopped because of COVID. Apparently they can't do it, even though we're doing this today, they can't have some kind of training. But it needs to happen because there's an enormous amount of turnover, right? So you have to at least start with who's ever on the ground doing the work and then try to do it like 3 months, you know, like quarterly, so that the new recruits can also hear this information. And when you do the training, because apparently there's a lot of training that happens on for Indigenous cultural sensitivity training, happens kind of across the board, but apparently doesn't work. You know why? Because you don't get an exam afterwards. So if you do a cultural training and then the police have to do an exam and they fail the exam, well, then there's consequences to that, right? They don't pass. They have to maybe do community service or they have to do something else. But, you know, it's one thing to sit and have to listen to a cultural training and be like, oh my God, I have to listen to this, as opposed to paying attention, doing an exam and passing it. So I guess for the future, that would definitely be something that I would love to see. I don't know if I'm going to see it, but I would love to see it. Also, can we not have like peacekeepers teach the SPVM or even like across Canada? Why can't, you know, Indigenous peacekeepers do this training? Because I know that someone had talked about, you know, sort of like the boys club, that police, you know, like they're one of the same kind in the same work field. So that might be more effective. And the, you know, the peacekeepers in Ganawage, there are peacekeepers that speak French, so they could do this. But for whatever reason, this has not actually happened. I think that, you know, the SPVM, they do have an Indigenous liaison worker, but he is not Native. And that is like really tough for Indigenous people to swallow, because what it says is, as a person that is not Indigenous, we think we can do a better job, right? And if they say, hey, we can't find anyone, well, I don't think you're trying hard enough, because there's peacekeepers in Ganawage and Aguazasne. You can find them if you wanted to. You just haven't made that effort. Don't make me find them for you. I can do it. Anyway, so that's pretty much what I have to say. I know I only have X amount of minutes to talk, but I think that, oh, wait a minute. I've got one more thing to say.
5 more minutes.
I so zoomed through that because I was like, so.
Felipe a little bit more time. I'll come back to you. I think I shortchanged you, sir.
I have one more thing to say. Okay. So I have 3 children. And, you know, I try to bring up my sons in a good way, and I try to teach them cultural pride, right? So my youngest is 8 years old, and he really wants to, you know, let everyone know that he's Native, and he wants to wear clothing that is Native, right? So I got him this hat. It says Cree, all right? So he's very happy to have his hat, but he comes to me one evening and he says, you know what, Mom, I love this hat. I can't wait to wear it outside. But if I see the police, I'm going to take it off. Now, my 8-year-old doesn't understand what racial profiling is, but he clearly understands what it is. He knows that he's also a target, that if he wears that hat and he sees the police, that he knows to take it off. So I'm just really hoping that for like the future, that we really try to do something better, because if the city has not responded to us about the racial profiling, about, you know, an update on these cases that have been closed or have been put aside, and there's no actual consequences for it, we start to lose faith. And it's, how many times do we have to go to the police with an olive branch and say, hey, why don't we try this? Why don't we do this? And then we get blocked all the time. We need a change to happen, and we need it to happen now. I don't want to have to wait another 2 years to hear what they're going to say about the fact that Indigenous women are 11 times more likely to be racial profiled. It should have been addressed 2 years ago, but we're still waiting. So feel free to put pressure on the police. Thank you very much for listening to me, and back to you, Alain.
Well, thank you very much. You still, you could use a little bit more time because we have to wait on Mr. Daguerre. But Mr. Tessier, perhaps you had a few more things you wanted to add, and then so I'll give you, another 5 minutes if you'd like.
Sure. Well, a couple of things I can mention about or add to my presentation since we have some more time. There is, and again, it goes and it follows what I was talking about earlier. The fact that there has been these reports, and Nakusset referred to it, the Armenia report, and there's been these position taken by institutions and such as ourselves, based on data, based on facts, based on findings. And I must say that us as an institution here, the Human Rights Commission, in the fall of 2019, we took a position to ask for the government to declare street checks illegal. And that flowed from reports in Ontario and Nova Scotia, and obviously some of members of the earlier panels know about them. So we're moving forward with all these things. And historically, in 2011, when the commission did its report, did not go as far as saying we need to stop these and declare, abolish these street checks. And so that was a step forward again for us as an institution. So these steps are being taken on a whole wide level, different levels. The other thing, and again, I wish to salute the panels before me, Professor Livingstone, Wortley. Professor Livingstone was very important for the cases that we brought before the HRT, because her expertise was put in proof before the HRT and was heavily relied by the court to determine the outcome of these cases. Because as some of you may know, these social contexts need to be put in place or in play before the courts, so to have a better legal understanding of what exactly is in play, and the power structures or these prejudice or these unconscious biases. And that is proof that has to be adduced and put forward and worked on by experts such as Professor Livingstone and Professor Wortley. So that data, that work that's being done in other provinces is also flowing into our commission, and we're relying and using that to adduce evidence before the courts, so to change that perspective for racial profiling before the courts. And that also, I think, there's been a key. I don't know if I don't want to use the word change, because key evolution in the last years based on that, based on what's been happening in Ontario and Nova Scotia, namely, but elsewhere also, because there are other international models we can rely on. So I think there's that all that thinking that's been going on, that now flows into the courts, and that helps us have better cases before the courts, and a better understanding from the judicial system of these social phenomena that are like racial profiling, for example. And the other thing I wanted to mention also is that there's a very important thing that we also need to remember, is that us as an institution, we have a role to play, but as Nakusset was mentioning, there are now so many groups and organizations that are actually engaging on a grassroots level. And I think the word was a bit more, let's act now, let's not delay, we want results. And I think also the voices of these groups has been more present. It's never enough, but still there's been a more awareness of this civil society discourse about the need for systemic remedies to these phenomena such as racial profiling. So I think that all these things that are put in play actually are right now increasing the speeds of change. Although yes, and I do appreciate that when you're in a Cousette seat, these changes never happen fast enough, and that I understand completely.
Thank you very much. I just want thank you very much for these thoughts. And yeah, you know, the courts have come up. Like I said, the last few cases have been, you know, significant orders, but we'll have to see how those orders are going to be implemented. And, you know, this has to be a follow-up. But I want to touch on Nakuset's point a little bit, because I was in the RCMP for a long time. And I'm proud of my career in the RCMP, but they've sinned against me. They've sinned against Indigenous people. I have seen it from the time I got to depot, and I've heard the stuff that I saw and heard being said about what we used to call them at the time special constables, the special constable program, native constable programs, and folks that were coming in. Like growing up, I have had very, very little exposure to Indigenous people myself. So really going to depot was my first time that I had that much experience. And the racism that I saw against those folks was unbelievable. I had no idea. And the bitterness and some of the things that my troop mates were saying and some of the things that they were putting these people through was absolutely unbelievable. So, and it carried on, you know, when I got out in the field, and I've heard some of the comments that folks that had done what they call native policing up north came back to the south, because I was stationed in Toronto. And you know, some of the stuff that they would share, it was absolutely unbelievable. In fact, you know, they were comparing the blacks in Toronto, like the natives up north, and the way in which we should be dealing with the blacks in Toronto. So that was extremely hurtful. And again, and so everything that you said is absolutely of no surprise to me. And I just wanted to make those comments. And one of the things I like about the Quebec Human Rights Commission definition is this second part, which speaks to the disproportionate measures applied by law enforcement officials against people based on race, ethnic origin, and so on. And I think that speaks to what you raised about in terms of over-responding to incidents that are really, there's no big deal, but because it's a Native person, Indigenous person, or blacks, then all of a sudden they're absolutely dangerous, and we have to come in and force to make sure that they don't get out of hand. So I just wanted to comment on that. And at the end of the day, you know, the policing culture is such an entrenched culture. And again, I mentioned the idea of having more rigorous sanctions, more rigorous court decisions, more rigorous laws. But at the end of the day, on a day-to-day basis, it's really what I call the soul of the organization that we need to change, and that we can't legislate. We need to continue changing, monitor their performances, how we deal with their behavior, and so on. So it's a work in progress, and I applaud folks like yourself, Nakuset, that haven't given up, clearly, and keep on putting the pressure on. Thank you.
I wonder if I could just briefly jump in, given that we have a few more minutes, with some of the questions that we've had coming through for the two panelists in the session, if that's all right, because I'm a little concerned, given the number of questions we have for panel 2, that we won't get to them. So if I can have your permission to do so. Metessier, I'd be very interested in your response to the point that Alain made earlier, which we've received some, which actually I had received some questions on bilaterally through the internet in response to this program on the issue of delays that Alain raised earlier. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then secondly, and Nakusette, your thoughts on the different experiences of Indigenous women versus Indigenous men on profiling. You mentioned the higher rates of profiling, or the high rates, I don't know what the comparative was, between women and men. Given your experience with the Native Women's Shelter, what is your observation with regard to the particular challenges being faced specifically by Indigenous women? So maybe Philippe André, we can start with you.
Well, I was about to leave the floor to my colleague, and I can talk about delays afterwards.
Thanks very much. Nakusette.
You know, we don't necessarily have statistics. It was that independent study that did this. We just know what we hear, you know, and we try to address each, you know, case if they're willing to, right? A lot of the women are afraid to say anything because they're afraid that there's going to be payback. So when a situation comes to us, we deal with it. We ensure that we will speak on their behalf, if we can keep them anonymous, we will. The thing is that what happens with the police is, like in the Cabot Square area, what they do is they do this sort of intimidation thing, right? So they'll like park their car in the park, or they'll just show up. You know, last summer they were showing up on horses. It's like, what are you doing here? You know, but right now at Cabot Square, we have a tent, right? We have the Raphael Andre Memorial tent. And one night the police showed up, and that night hardly anyone came to the tent. So you see, there's this problem where the relationship has not been mended. Everything that Alain was talking about, this is what they know from their communities. They come into the city, they're not being treated any better. And then they know that when the police show up, they better go. They're going to go somewhere. They're going to go and be somewhere sort of out of sight. So in case something happens. So we have to literally, every time we see it. So when I say we, I'm talking about the people at the tent, the intervention workers, the people that are working on the ground that see this behavior. We are the ones that report it. It's not the people that receive this kind of treatment that report it. They won't say anything. And there was once a time where we wanted to do this sort of experiment where we would take like police pictures, right? So, you know, when you have mugshots and you go into like you know, someone assaults you and you go and you look through these mugshots, we want to do the opposite. We wanted to have all the police officers' faces so that those that were victimized by police, they can identify them. It was an idea that was brought up, didn't actually happen, but we were trying to figure out how can we support you through this? How can we do this in a way where you don't fear the police? But you see, it's this relationship where we keep trying to help. We're waiting for the police to come to us and say, this is the recommendations. We saw your letter and this is what we're doing moving forward. Effective immediately, we're going to do A, B, C, D, F, G. We're still waiting. Why do we need to keep waiting, right? And what's frustrating is that, you know, we speak to the mayor, we speak to other people. They're like, yes, we hear you. And then we never hear from them again. I literally sometimes finish these meetings. I'm like, what happened? Did we do anything? Like it gets difficult. But what we do now is every single instance that we see, we address. And then, you know, we try. And if we have to bring in other parties like the AFNQL, Quebec Native Women, whoever it is, to work with us, that's what we need to do. But we are still waiting for the police to also extend that olive branch and say, we see what's happened. We would like to apologize for targeting Indigenous women more than anyone else. Waiting. Be happy to receive an email after this, you know, conference.
I guess it's my turn now, Pearl. So the question about delays, a very important question. As some of you already know, this is an obsession of on my part as a president of this commission. And I just want to salute That's Daguerre, who has joined us. There was reference made by a case that was lost because of delays. These cases have been a thorn on the side of the human rights system in Quebec. They are not something on which we are watching idly by. If I may say so, the situation in which these decisions were rendered talk about decisions for events that occurred prior to 2017. So when I joined the commission, and what I can tell you is that since I've joined the commission, we've put in place a series of measures to make sure that we are no longer faced with these decisions, or at least no longer faced with these demands on part of institution or respondents that say that these unreasonable delays need to relieve them of the discriminatory acts that we allege that they committed. So one thing that has to be understood by everybody here is that the commission is an institution, yes, but an institution that has seen over the last 10 years an increase of 122% in the number of cases being filed before it. As any public institution, it has not been necessarily has not necessarily received all the attention and care it needed in the last 10 years. Fortunately, through the actions that we took in the last couple of years, there was actually additional financing that was obtained by the Commission in the fall of 2019 for adding investigators and people that take care of these cases to alleviate or at least make these delays that are unreasonable in nature a thing of the past for the Commission. There's also things that have been done on the legislative side, because we're looking at all steps or leaving no stones unturned to see what can be done as a commission to make sure that especially cases such as profiling, racial profiling cases, which are cases that are not easily, we talked about expert evidence, we talked about these cases not being something very easy to prove, although recent decisions obviously are a step in the right direction. But just to give you an idea, these complaints or these cases have been about 50% of the cases for racial profiling, about 50% of the cases that we put forward the Human Rights Tribunal last year. Of all our cases that we've put forward under the race or ethnic origin motives. So there is a lot of pressure also on that to adapt and change. Another thing I want to mention also is that I was talking earlier about the change in perception about how things are being done. These concepts in 10 years ago were fairly new. And there was a lot of resistance on the part of respondent cities or the SQ to even recognize the fact. And so it was a very hard road to take to go before I even get to the HRT. And all steps or all, measures were taken to make sure that these things took a lot of time, if I can put it bluntly. We're not there anymore, at least for a lot of these cases. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but we're not seeing the same level of resistance as before. And obviously, again, that's because of the changing, I think, social landscape and the fact that these cases have been reduced and improved. So it's always hard for a public body such as ourselves to actually start and generate enough case law, enough work, or enough, I'm searching for my words in English here, but enough things or internal expertise to actually develop that through time. You have to acquire that. It does not happen overnight, although it would be all very nice. So when you were faced with that, I think that the response to your question is these delays are for us as an institution are things of the past, and what we're looking at right now is that we're no longer looking at these kinds of delays here. These are fortunately for the complainants a thing of the past, and we'll make sure that that never comes back at the Human Rights Commission, because I don't think it's something we need to be proud of.
Any more question, Pearl, or?
No, I think we have Mr. Daguerre here, and warm welcome to you, Mr. Daguerre. It's lovely to have you with us, and back over to you, Alain.
Yes, so Mr. Directeur Daguerre, bienvenue. Et the floor is yours, sir. Allez-y. Vous pouvez, oh, vous êtes en mute, hein? You're muted, Mr. Daguerre.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know if people know me. I'm a police officer for the last 30 years, 25 years in the SPVM, and 5 years now in Longueuil Police. I'm the chief of the police. What I would like to talk today is about the issue of racial profiling, systemic discrimination. Right away, from the beginning, from many years ago, I recognized the racial profiling in the police department. I also recognize the systemic discrimination. For me, discrimination is larger than only the part of racial. The racial part is very important, but we can see all kind of discrimination in the society. So even to try to get an apartment or to try to get a job. So for me, it's, from the beginning, I recognize those huge issues. So today, what I would like to show you is what in the police of Longueuil we're trying to do. We can focus on individual training, and I think it's important. It's always going to be important to focus on the police officers and try to bring them to change. That's why we in Longueuil we talk about the change of culture, but it comes with a reform, a very, very deep reform, including a systemic approach. And I would like to show you today what I'm talking about. So what you're going to see today is, yes, we are focusing on the police officer themselves, but also we are focusing on the whole system, because if you don't attack those two issues on the same time, I think I've been working on those cases for the last 15 years. And I think it's, if you only train people individually, the amount of information they're going to retain is not going to last very long, maybe 10 or 50% maximum going to stay in the brain, in the conscious. And very fast, very soon after that, they're going to have some behavior with unconscious bias or sometimes conscious bias. So it's not enough. I think it's important, but to review the whole system and go deep in the reform, I think it's one of the way that we're trying to do it in Longueuil. So I don't know who's sharing my my file on the screen. Is it Catherine?
Yes, I'll share it. 1 minute.
Thank you. What you're going to see is the cycle of life of a police officer, and the item that you're going to see on that slide, we can add during the, we are learning, by the way. It's like having a plane in the air. We are building that plane. We are learning, and every time we're advancing, maybe something lacking, we're going to add it. And it's keep changing every second. Okay, so you have the lifeline of SPAL culture of change. So what we did from the beginning, the candidate profile, to the end, to the next chief in Longueuil, we're trying to review the whole system. When I'm talking about the system, this is one of the system that we are attacking. So right now, the human resources of Longueuil Police in the city of Longueuil, they review the whole criteria. We are focusing much more on people who have social skills than technical skills. To give you an example, in the past, to be part of the army of security, you get some points. Now, if you work in the community groups, if you did some benevola, if you work in a hospital with psychiatric aid services, I mean, well, you're going to have more points than only technical. So right there, we are changing the profile of the candidate. And not later than a few months ago, I received a profile for the last 33 candidates. To be honest with you, I don't have it here, but I will show you. If I have it, I will show it to you. The result is amazing. First of all, 18% are from minority visible. Over, I don't remember exactly the percentage, but huge percentage of people with social skills. Why I'm asking to change the profile of the candidates, because 70% of our police calls, 70% of 911 calls are all social calls, are no more criminal calls. So the police department have to change the way they approach those issues. They are much more complicated. It's very complex the way we are responding on the call now. So we cannot be only technical. We have to be more emotionally involved in those calls. Staffing recruitment, that also we are choosing with the next point, integration of a recruit. We are, during the 3-4 weeks of integration in the police, we are changing the whole system also. What we're trying to do is during those classes, the new recruit sit in the class and try to, he listen to the teachers, to what is longer about, what are the clientele. Instead of talking only about the technical, now we are talking about more mental health, diversity, how to approach the people, how to be, the behavior that we're expecting from them, the respect that we're expecting from them, the opening that we're expecting from them with the community. Recruit training agent, extremely, extremely important points. In the court of the police, when a recruit comes in, he sits with a coach, we call it the recruit training agent. That trainer, we have to make sure that he follow exactly the values that we want in our society. In the past, including me, what happened to me, when you get as a recruit, the coach sit next to you, say, okay, kid, I'm gonna show you what's the real police. Forget what you learned before, I'm gonna show you what's the real police. Well, that's exactly what we want to break. We want him to take all the skills that young police officers have, which we think are good skills. If there's some not good, we're gonna redirect and make sure that they learn the right way. So that part of the cycle of life is extremely important, because this is where the recruit breaks. If the trainer doesn't have the value that we want, well, he's going to make sure that police officer is going to follow the other culture, the culture that we don't want. Immersion program. I don't know if you heard about it. It's an innovative program. It's every police officer for Longueuil Police is going to go through that program, and they're going to go through that program every 5 years. 60 now, because of the COVID, we were not able to do it during the COVID, but the next batch we're hoping to be in the fall, October, November. And in that program, we ask, first of all, I'm going to be honest and very transparent with you, not many people believe that this program will happen in Quebec province. So in my department also, many people thought that there's no way the cops will accept that approach. So what we did, we went to meet all the cops on the field. And let's say I approached 300 cops, and I explained to them that they're going to be going in the community, living with them for 5 weeks. No uniform, no gun. You're going to go eat dinner, supper, go to the grocery with the family, go to meet the kids, go to the school with the kids. You're going to have to learn what those families are going through, what kind of profile criteria those families had, where we went from all different origins. We did with the family, immigrant family, with people with family who the kids have some issue with mental health, autism. We went with different kind of people, homeless people, and we made sure that those cops stay with them during 5 weeks, not 3 hours, not 1 day, 5 weeks. One of the approaches that we wanted to make sure that the cops understand, we want them in action. We don't want them sitting in a classroom and listening to a teacher. We want them to learn from action, being with the community. That program, 5 weeks, no gun, no uniform in the community, it's gonna happen 60 cops a year during 5 years, and then we're gonna do it again. You know what? At my biggest surprise, the police officer didn't know what was they gonna go through during those 5 weeks. Every day they had an assignation. Every morning they receive a paper, what they're gonna be doing during the day or during the next 2 days. Well, everybody got surprised. On the 300 police officer, right away, we got 120 volunteers. That showed me that cops wants to learn. They are curious. They want to be able to go and meet the community. 120 cops volunteer to be without uniform and no gun. The process and procedure, that's a very important point. We are looking into it, and we even asking university, and I would like to talk about evaluation after, but we ask the university, independent university, to do an audit on our procedures and our process, the way we work inside, and to make sure that there's nothing with any stereotype, anything that can touch, can hurt any community. Finding the future managers. Well, now that when we want people to go in higher level, which is close to me, well, we make them through psychological exams, but also we take them to a boot camp. In that boot camp, they spend 3-4 days, and to be honest with you, after 1 day, they are so deep in emotions that we can see the true person. And after that, after those results, we decide who do we choose to go up in the organization, or who we choose not to bring them up. So a lot of aspects of the emotional intelligence are evaluated in that when we want to find the future managers. Periscope, what's Periscope? Well, Periscope is the evaluation of every year the police officer gonna go through that evaluation. On 11 ability or competence, on 11 competence, 8 of them are all emotional intelligence and not technical. In my past experience, very, very, very often is always technical. How many arrestation, how many observation, how many ticket that you give. Periscope have nothing to do with those kind of evaluation. It's principally, how do you approach the community? How do you talk to the community? How are you open? So this lifeline of the SPARK culture change, it's been right now, at the moment I'm talking to you, even if it's been only 1 year, it's been evaluated by independent university, the whole process. There's one team who's evaluating the process of procedure, but there's also another department who's evaluating the whole lifeline to see if are we on target, how can we get better. I don't know if you have the other slide. Sorry. Okay, so this resume what I just mentioned to you, the candidate profile review, the human experience, relation, rational intelligence, also the staffing of recruitment review, I just mentioned it also, the integration of the recruit, we introduce and we do the induction prep period to really look into the human distress, the cultural variety during that training. Recruit training trainer agent. I told you about it. Those people are going to become my ambassadors. Can you pass to the next slide, please? I guess I can continue. So today, what I was trying to do with you is to pass the message that we can focus. Okay, I see the immersion program. You can see it now. The process of the procedure review and the funding future manager. Okay, so I passed through all those idem. Right. So the main message I want to pass is there racial profiling in the police department? Yes, there is. Is there a systemic issue, systemic discrimination? Yes, there is. Now, if we think to attack it on the individual training immersion program that you see on the screen right now, the number 5, it is a program that touches the individual person. But if we do only the immersion program, it will not last long. I think the police, one of the effects of this program, I'm going to give you an example. When those police officers went back on the patrol, the first thing that the 911 department called me and told me, Mr. Daguerre, those cops that went to immersion right now, they're taking much longer on the 911 call. I was like, okay, keep them on those calls. I don't want them to turn corners. I want them to make sure that they're going to resolve the problem. So this is one of the things that we saw is that the call, the 911 call, those police officers stay much longer to discuss with the community, to talk and find longer solution. But I'm telling you, and I'm going to be very transparent with you, this program, the immersion program, on its own, alone, in 2-3 years, are going to have to redo it completely again. So that's why, on the same time, reviewing the profile of the candidate, better training at the entrance, have an amazing coach, amazing ambassador who's going to train that police officer, have a better evaluation on the emotional intelligence, have immersion program, choosing the best bosses in the police department who are really aligned with the mentality, with the vision. All those aspects are going to make a difference. Also, I can add, it's not a line and a lifeline right now, but we are thinking about it in the team. The first level of management, so the supervisor, him or her also, we have to review the way we are choosing them to make sure they align with the vision. Voilà. I hope I didn't take too much time, I'm sorry.
No, you had lots of time, there's more than enough. Well, thank you very much. I'm so glad that you're here and that you've presented what I call a very progressive approach to police management. And so I'm kind of proud that we got you on board because from my experience, there are very, very, very few what I consider progressive police administrators out there. Very few. A couple of things that looking at your chart, which by the way, I agree 100%. In order to change what I call the soul of a police agency, you got to start from recruiting right on through to pension. And everything has to be in sync. In other words, if you have a zero tolerance policy, it has to be from recruiting all the way through to pension. It has to be consistent. A couple of things jumped at me though in your presentation that perhaps you might want to consider is at the front end, as part of the recruiting process, it's a good thing to look at community service and all these kind of things. But I think there has to be a very rigorous implicit bias testing at the very front end. In other words, you got to have a threshold that beyond a certain threshold, and those tests exist. Harvard University has one, and I'm sure they have them in French as well. But you have to, at the front end, determine those that have those what we call implicit biases, and sometimes they're even explicit biases. So you got to make sure that you flag them very early. And the next thing that I would recommend that you, and perhaps you have it, but it's just not part of your presentation, it's what I call an early warning system to identify what I call serial profilers. Serial profilers are people that they go through their career, like, Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis is the perfect example of having 17 complaints of excessive use of force against him, and then he ended up murdering George Floyd. So you need that kind of early warning system to identify those folks. And of course, that implicit bias training, in my opinion, should also apply to supervisors and I would argue higher managers as well, because discrimination and racism occur at all ranks in policing. And so this is very encouraging. I just want to mention one thing. What I see is that's problematic in the way in which police officers are recruited in this province, particularly, is the fact that police tech is the only main point of entry to the profession. Yeah, you have little programs where you can have somebody with a degree that, you know, but the main point of entry is police tech. And as you mentioned earlier, if you want to have a force that's diverse in terms of abilities and technical, not just police technical, but I think we should open up the profession to other degrees, sociology, psychology, a variety of college diplomas that would be helpful to the police as a whole. So that would be my comments. But again, thank you so much for your very progressive.
Can I speak?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. I would like to come back at you're absolutely right. The implicit bias and the explicit bias from the recruitment, that's something we're going to look into it. I know that we have some criteria, but to be quite honest and clear, I don't think it's that well specified, but we're going to look into it. The early warning, we do have it. And I watched the same thing that you watched, the 17 event that happened at police office. Doesn't make sense, but we do have that early warning. Police tech is very interesting because at one point I was thinking, and I don't know if because one thing is that it's interesting is in the province of Quebec, there's two ministers taking care of the police department. There's the educational minister for the CEGEP, and then you become a police. You go to the academy, which is the public security minister. So two different ministers. I think they're talking to each other, but why not? And I'm just throwing the idea. Since we have those candidates who are going through the technique policière, maybe your proposition will be examined during the green book that the Minister Geneviève Guilbeault asked to see the reform of the police. Maybe she's going to propose it, but we can propose something also. Why don't the 3 years of technique policière, you add a fourth year, and that year would be social approach. All the on the bias, you can talk about the bias, implicit and explicit bias. We can talk about mental health. We can talk about social approach. We can talk about emotional intelligence. So even with that technique policière of 3 years, add another year, but make sure that year is not technical, but only on those emotional skills. So there's solutions. I'm sure there's a way we can do things differently. It's just to think about it and to innovate.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Province, Quebec being the only province that actually has a mandatory technique policière or police tech program that someone wanting to access the police profession has to take. And that to me has an impact on who gets into that program, because it's highly different. The marks are extremely high to get into. And there are folks that, because of social conditions and whatnot, will not have the necessary marks to get into those programs. And so, it can be construed as somewhat discriminatory to having just that one program. It's the only province that has that in the whole country, but something that we might want to ponder. That would be my comment on that. So I'm kind of opening, I guess, we're opening up for questions.
Yeah, we are in a second, but I guess I would like to, Nakaset, if I could ask you a question, and you should feel entirely free to say no. But I would love to know, as somebody who's been through what you described with us, in terms of your work with the Native Women's Shelter, in terms of what women have been experiencing, in terms of what has been happening at Cabot Square in the presence of police. You have in front of you one of Quebec's most progressive police leaders. I'd love to know what you would have to say to him. I know that Longueuil is not where you spend most of your time, but I'd be interested in knowing, from the perspective of what you have been talking about and living through, what is the message you would like to send to police leadership in Quebec, if any?
Okay, but this program, when did it start?
2018.
Okay, so like, and the statistics on whether or not, like, do you speak to the community to see whether or not they're happy with the results? Do they feel like they're less racially profiled? You know, like what are, you know, what are
I
people
think
saying?
that's a great question. First of all, when we tried to do the immersion program, the immersion program was in 2019, but we started the line of change from 2018. But just to give you an example, the immersion program, we had to approach many families and community groups. Most of them at the beginning, Madame, like you said, they refused because there's a lack of trust with the police. They refused at the beginning. They refused right away, and slowly, we convinced some of the groups and the family, and we got to be able to do the first training of immersion program 2019. We got 45 group and family who accept us in the houses, in the buildings. When we finished with that program, after that, but the COVID arrived right away. More families and more groups asked, please come back. Come back. We need to meet you more and more often. Doesn't mean it's perfect. I'm sure we're going to make some mistakes again. We are doing mistakes today. We did before and we're going to do tomorrow. But they see there's a real volonté, willingness to change, will to change. It doesn't mean we're going to make 100% success, but I'm convinced by attacking the problem on the systemic approach, I'm sure we're going to have more success than what we had in the past. But you're right, many people didn't trust us, and some of them still don't trust us, and I understand that.
Okay, so it was like 45 police officers that participated in this in 2019?
30 police officers, 45 families and groups, community groups received us inside the building and the houses.
Okay, how many police officers do you have in total?
In the patrol, this is the people I'm focusing. I have on patrol, on 911 call, I have 300 cops. And I have 120 volunteers. So almost 40%, they want to go to that training right away.
Yeah, but it should be across the board. It shouldn't just be like 30 that are receiving it, because will that trickle down, right? And
Yeah.
Are you saying that, you know, they were hanging out with homeless people for like 5 weeks? They literally walked around with homeless people for 5 weeks outside in the cold? Is that what you're saying?
What they did exactly, first of all, is 30 cops twice a year, so 60 cops a year.
Okay.
They're going to go through that training. After 5 years, I will pass those 300 cops, and the first 30 that they did in 2019, in 2023 or 2024, they're going to have to go back again. Okay. When I mentioned 5 weeks, during those 5 weeks, they were spending time with homeless people, but not 5 weeks, but because 2-3 days later, they had to go with immigrant families, with Congolese families, example. 2-3 days later, they have to spend 3 days with autism family, who are the kids who have autism. So they had to go with diversity groups to be able to understand what's going on in the family. To give you an example, une femme voilée, I don't know how you say it in
veiled women, yeah, or hijabi.
Or Muslim,
hijabi.
Yeah. So they spent time during the day, evening, and also they went to the grocery with her to understand what she's going through every day, how people are looking at her, how they make her feel because she wears that hijab. Another example, they went to school and saw how the young kids who have autism be treated by other kids to understand the reality of the mother or the father of those kids. No, they didn't spend 5 weeks with the homeless person. But during those 5 weeks, they dealt with homeless people, with people with autism, with people from community, with people from different origins.
So what you're saying is they jumped around from one group to another for 5 weeks in total.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you actually send people to Indigenous communities?
In Longueuil, not yet. But what I'm saying, the life, how you say it, we're going to learn when we go. Definitely. And to be honest with you, Indigenous community, we didn't send them there. Chinese or Asian community also, we were not able to do it the first shot. There's other community we were not able to do it, but the next one, we're going to be doing other groups, and we always going to be changing, not complete the program, but adapting the program. That's why I want them to go every 5 years, because the issue today with this group, maybe in 5 years, is going to be a different group. So I got to make sure that they're going to be able to deal with different groups. Like maybe 2025, we're going to have issues, I don't know, with the Russian community. So I got to make sure they're going to go meet the Russian community also. We're trying to meet different groups. Yes.
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, Nakuset, you had something. Of course, that's the beginning, right? I mean, it's only been what, 2.5 years. One of the things that I'm looking forward to seeing too, which came out of the De Bellefeuille recommendation, is training, racial profiling training, as opposed to diversity and inclusion training, because it's nice to have, what you're doing is great, by the way, but I think it's just the beginning of a much longer, much more rigorous process that needs to be put in place, and racial profiling, specifically racial profiling training.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Yeah, Alain, you're cutting out.
Okay.
So maybe we can give it a couple of minutes and then circle back. But Nakusa, you were about to say something earlier when we were, I saw that. So do you want to finish that thought?
Well, I'm just saying, it's sort of like, what's your priority, right? Like if there's a really long extended issue with policing and Indigenous people, and we're going to do it next year or the year after, it's sort of like, when do we get acknowledged, and 30 police officers or 60 is still a drop in the bucket. So yes, absolutely, what you're doing is progressive. It just needs to be a little bit more focused on the immediate needs, because I was going to just tell all Indigenous people, let's all move to Laval, but wait a minute, you get no training on Indigenous people. All right, stay where you are. So we want to sort of, yeah, we should maybe talk at some point, or you should go to Gunawaga and speak to the peacekeepers there. Yeah, there's an idea.
To be honest with you, I will do whatever it takes to be able to progress and do our job better. Absolutely. Like Mr. Babineau say, just to put in place this program, and like you said, 5 weeks, having 120 cops volunteer, so 40% of my police department, my police officers being volunteer to do it, for me, there's a lot of hope that those people on their own, they want to go. And maybe it's not well known, but to ask those police officers to take off the uniform and the weapon and go in the community, I can tell you one thing, in 30 years of police officer, as my experience, nobody thought it would happen, nobody, including my own advisors around me. I say, we're going to do it. And trust me, we're going to do it.
There's this term in the RCMP that we know, if I'm not cutting out, there's this term in the RCMP that we use, voluntold.
Yeah.
Because if you ask for volunteers, typically you get nobody. So yeah, if you're able to get that many volunteers and not voluntold, that to me is significant. My point, and I think I was cutting out earlier, but my point is I want to see racial profiling training as opposed to diversity and inclusion training, because otherwise the needle isn't moving. And that's—
You're right.
So, thanks to all of you. Please stay on because a number of questions are for you directly. Thanks very much for Alain for spearheading and taking the leadership of the session. Much appreciated. So the first question is actually to Marlene and Scott. And then I'd like to have Fadi, if I may use first names, respond to their responses. So the first question is, how do we improve police accountability mechanisms? We have multiple avenues, as we all know, and as we've discussed, for improving accountability around police. We have the criminal law, we have police ethics commissions, we have human rights commissions, we have the civil courts, of course. There's a general sense, and Scott, to some extent, your research addresses this in terms of trust levels, that these mechanisms are insufficient, and that civilian oversight in particular has not delivered on the promise. So maybe Scott, starting with you and then perhaps moving to Marlene, what are your thoughts on what can be done to make this work? So both of you, and then over to Fadi for a response.
I think with respect to, there's two things I'd like to mention. First, with respect to civilian oversight, I think across the nation, a lot of civilian oversight has been kind of public relations oversight. When it comes down to who is actually investigating, for instance, complaints against the police, most civilian oversight agencies may receive the complaint, they may document the complaint, but the complaint is then returned to the police service, in question, who do their own investigation and are responsible for adjudication as well. I think, we did a survey that was just published this year, and we asked a cross-section of Canadians about civilian oversight. Over 90% were all for it. But over 95% indicated that they thought if there was a complaint against the police, it should not be investigated by the police. And they assumed that civilian oversight meant that. So I think there's a little bit of sleight of hand, that there's kind of a feeling that a label of civilian oversight, many people, because they will not have a complaint against the police, kind of accept that and say, well, there's civilian oversight, without realizing that the mechanism may not necessarily work. I would also get back to data collection with respect to evaluating, whether or not the initiatives actually work or not. So for instance, we've had 30 years of training on these issues with the objective that training will, one, change officers' behavior, and two, increase confidence, community confidence. I haven't seen, if anything, racial disparities are worse now than they were before. And confidence in the police, particularly in Black and Indigenous communities, has remained low throughout this period. To me, that an evaluation would show that these, whatever it is we're doing, whatever training has been implemented, is not working. And with training, I would get also back to the issue of, do you have to pass the training, or do you have to tick a box? And I think many of the officers, an institution underscores what it finds important by highlighting what you have to pass and show competence at. It is sending a message about what it thinks is not important when you have to take training, but you don't have to pass it. And I think that that's a major impediment to oversight. I have a lot of other ideas, but I want Marlene to go to. So.
Well, let me start by saying I agree with single thing you said, Scott. I was going to talk about race-based data collection, actual training, that not ticking a box, that if it's important, then you have to pass it. And I think the best example that everybody here will know about is what happened with Jocelyn Ottawa, and the two nurses who ended up being fired had actually taken the diversity or cultural sensitivity training. All of the employees at that institution, health institution, had taken the training, and yet they were the object of a complaint by an Indigenous woman, that she had been humiliated, that she had been made to feel devalued, etc., and that she was afraid to actually complain to those two nurses or to anyone else, because she was afraid if she did, she wouldn't receive any health support or assistance. So yes, the training has to be mandatory, and you have to pass it. That sends a real message to all police officers, but also to the community, that the organization, the government, actually believes that this is something important. In the same way that if you take your target range shooting, In order to be able to manipulate a weapon, you have to pass it. Otherwise, you can't become a police officer. So same thing. And I just want to say to Fadi, I commend you and your organization because you are showing real leadership. Is everything perfect? No, you yourself say it's not, and that's why you've got expert researchers and scientists working with you so that you can actually have evidence-based information that you can change going on. My sole worry is that you are the leader, Fadi. What happens if and when you leave? Will the cultural transformation of your organization within the organization, but also with the municipal government, l'agglomération, which that's where your money comes from, your budget. Are they on board? Are they showing leadership in supporting what the cultural transformation that you're trying to bring about?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know.
I'm told I only ask good questions. And if you don't think I do, just keep quiet.
No, you know, that's one of the reasons why, and me, I've been in the police department for the last 30 years. That's why by implementing the system, change the system from the recruit to the next chief, I don't think, listen, maybe I'm a dreamer, and sometimes it's good to dream, but I don't think some people are going to be able to change that system after we implement it. How can you change the whole system plus immersion program when the chief is gone? It's going to be inside the culture, and people are going to have to go through it. Because don't forget, the criteria to have the new recruit is implicate the human resources of the city of Longueuil. So it's not Fadi, it's the human resources are changing the way they're recruiting people. So, and goes and goes and goes. I would like, so what we're trying to do is to implement a different system. So when the day I'm gone, it will be able to continue. I would like to come back on what Scott was mentioning and the civil oversight and the police and the policy plus the discipline plus the mechanism. I can tell you, I discipline police officer on racial profiling. We put in place policy. We had sometimes some oversight people watching and telling us this is not the right way to do. But as long we don't get from the inside, so sometimes I see some activist group against the police or accusing the police, and you know what? I think everybody's important. I think everybody in society, we need to have them to raise the voice. But I am from the inside, and I decide to stay from the inside to be able to bring the change. Some people from the outside are doing it, and it's important to do it. But who is from the inside who's going to do it also? So that's why by changing the system, yes, we have policy, but God knows when you put policy, how can you make sure that everybody's going to follow it the same way they're going to follow it? Anything to do with the training, I just want to mention one thing. As long as the training is being observed by human being, it's going to be subjective, never objective. And even with some criteria, and I think it's important to pass the training. I think the idea, I took it in notes, and I'm going to try to look to how we can put it in Longueuil Police. I think it's a great idea to pass the training. But we have to make sure that the person who's evaluating me or Scott or Marlon is evaluating the same way. With this. And honestly, as long as you put the human being behind the pen, sometimes there's some variation. So that also we have to be careful. So yes, policy, discipline, and mechanism we have to have them in the police department. But again, I come back from the recruit, like Alain Bambino mentioned before, to the next chief. The whole life of the police officer for the next 30 years have to be on the watch, audit it, and make sure that the person is going through the system. But I would like to add one more word before I stop. One thing worries me a lot, and I would like people to listen very, very carefully. It's when the cities and the politician decide to put some rules in place and ask the police department zero tolerance in application. We want you to applicate those rules for the community. Example, in the early 2000, in the city of Montreal, decide to have zero tolerance sur les incivilités, zero tolerance on incivility. Ask the cops to go in the park and give tickets to anybody in the public area. Well, you know what? There were a lot of racial profiling happening there. Because who was in those parks? Wasn't the people from Westmount? Was the people from Montreal North, of Côte des Neiges, or Saint-Michel? So we have to be really careful. Different part of the society, cops, absolutely, we have to be careful and train. But leaders of the community, politicians of the community, be careful the rules that you're putting in place. I just want to mention that, sorry.
Don't be sorry. This is what it's all about. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the outcome of Nakaset and Fadi having a conversation later on. Maybe we'll hear about the results of it next year, Nakaset, when we do all of this again. I just wanted to just make a brief clarification. There were a case that Marlene was just talking about in terms of the Indigenous woman who I believe was at the Joliette Hospital. Her surname is Echequan. It's Joyce Echequan. So always worth saying people's names. So I wanted to add a couple of questions. Yes.
Pearl, I'm going to
yes.
interrupt you.
Yes.
I was not talking about Joyce Echequan.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you.
I was talking about Jocelyn Ottawa, whose brother is the chief or the vice chief of one of the communities.
Okay.
And yes, I don't remember where it happened, but the two nurses involved, it wasn't filmed. Okay. The two, and she didn't die.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. Yes, I
Okay.
think it was because the first name was Joyce and then the Ottawa, so we weren't
Yeah.
sure which one you were getting at. Thanks very much for the
Jocelyn.
clarification. Thank you very much for the clarification. Okay, so the next question is for Anne-Marie and Kanika, and I know that you two have hard stops at 5, so I will get right to it. You've talked about police violence, state violence, the implications for particular communities. Kanika, that concept that you so powerfully brought to the fore of having a race-centered approach. What are your thoughts on shifting some of the funds currently allocated to police departments to other resources that prioritize de-escalation, community-specific solutions, and alternatives to incarceration? Of course, these issues have been front and center for several months, and having regard to your presentations, I think it would be very helpful to get both of your perspectives in that regard. Kanika, would you like to start?
Certainly. So if this is speaking to the idea of kind of defunding the police or detasking the police, I would say that I support the idea that we should be allocating funding to social services that will help create healthier communities. And I also do support the idea of helping to assist with, de-escalating. Is that, sorry, just to make sure I understand the question, is that also speaking to defunding as well?
So it could be defunding or detasking. I mean, obviously there's different stages along this spectrum, and there are obviously two extremes to that spectrum. But yeah, anywhere you land on that spectrum.
Certainly. So yeah, I do agree. I think that it's the term defunding, it seems to be problematic because a lot seem to think it's synonymous with the idea of abolishing the police. And I think that that's not the case. The case is to try to focus on other areas that we can help assist communities that won't lead to criminality in the first place. And so that speaks to a number of social services that should be funded, as opposed to the gross amounts of money that is generally channeled to police services. So I certainly support that initiative and think it's something that we should explore further.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, are you available? There you are.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with Kanika's general points. And the question brought to mind two, I guess, comments maybe I'd like to make is that there's been, I think the movement of defunding is also a reaction to the fact that, there's been a dismantling of the welfare state, and in the process, we've replaced that with increased policing, increased law enforcement. So there's been I guess you could say not a disjuncture between our increased investment in policing and our decreased investment in welfare. And so I think we absolutely need to reverse that trend. There's no reason why, policing has been increased over time. I think Scott Wortley's research has showed that crime rates have not actually been increasing to justify the expansion of law enforcement. And, back to my point of the ways in which we think about crime and who ought to be the object of surveillance and punishment is also highly racialized. And one of the things that, we were struck in the neighborhood was that when we looked at the police's own data, the rate of delinquency, in spite of the fact that, the SPVM was talking all about the threat of Black gangs, Black and Latino gangs, the rate of delinquency in this majority Black neighborhood was lower than the average for the city of Montreal. Despite that, the proportion of kids in the neighborhood who had arrest records was one of the highest in the city of Montreal. Right. So you see how a racializing discourse produces these kinds of results. And my personal view, having spent time in the neighborhood, would to be reduce all possibilities of contact. This is open for discussion, but between officers and Black youth. There are too many opportunities for contact.
And would anyone like to respond to either of those comments?
I just want to understand the last word that you just mentioned. Are you for no? You propose less contact between the police and the youth? Sorry, I don't.
Well, yeah, because we have numerous examples in our report, of police intervening while they're just on regular patrols in the park. Stopping kids for ID checks, surveying them from a distance when absolutely nothing is happening. So this kind of, and one of the examples I like to share is one that distressed me enormously. I was hearing a young man, Black man, tell us that he was walking home one day and a police car drove by him and slowed down, and the two officers just looked at him silently without saying a word. Then they drove away and they came back. I think they came back 2 or 3 times again to slow down and watch him from a distance without saying a word. And this guy was just walking home. And you can imagine what that kind of experience does to your sense of safety, to your sense of rights as a citizen. It's devastating. And so why were these officers doing that is my question. Why are they there in the first place? And the sort of excessive involvement in the lives of Black and brown youth is troubling.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Hypothetically, okay? Hypothetically, tomorrow I meet you, yeah, and I propose you to bring the 30 cops in the community with immersion program, no uniform, no gun, just to go sit and meet with the community and spend 5 weeks with them. How would you react?
I would replace them with social workers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand. Yeah. But you see, for me, it's definitely we need to build more bridges. We need to build more communication, more connection with the community. Me, I will always try, because I saw it from my own eyes when the people meet outside the intervention, like outside the 911 car or outside the patrol, and they meet together human to human. It's a totally different connection. It doesn't mean
I understand those arguments. My only problem with them is that we need to question the very institution of policing and what role it's playing in these lives of vulnerable groups. I think I mean, I didn't have enough time to portray it, but there are questions to be raised about how deeply involved the police is in the lives of ordinary people and to a degree that is excessive for certain populations. And so certainly, human, how should I say, I think police officers have the potential for changing, but I think the very institution is a problem, not the officers. The institution is a problem.
That's why I mentioned, sorry, Scott, go.
Just to reiterate some of the points that we've been making, and the research we've done on racial profiling over the years and its consequences. And, one of the big consequences is that, Black and Indigenous people who have never engaged in crime, who are law-abiding, are much more likely to be subjected to kind of humiliating stops and searches and questioning, and relay these stories to each other, and it becomes part of the fabric of the community. But it's also the fact that youth who engage in minor criminality, which is very normal. If you're a white kid growing up in Canada and you're going to steal, or you're going to smoke weed, or you're going to engage in kind of risk-taking activity, you grow out of it, you move on, and you become, you're never stigmatized by it. That's not what happens. I think what we're talking about here is, because of racial profiling, if you're Black or Indigenous or another targeted group, your chances of getting caught, your chances of paying the price in the justice system are exponentially higher. And we had a recent study that an MA student of mine conducted, where I interviewed 6 Black drug dealers from a public housing units in Toronto about how they got involved, their start, their motivation, their lives, and also 6 Black white drug dealers from university fraternities and sororities, where high volumes of drugs are traded and sold very freely. And one of there was many commonalities in terms of their economic motivation and how they got their product and how they set a price and how they sold, very similar within 2 groups. But one of the biggest differences was that the white fraternity drug dealers never worried about the police. They were not watched, they were not surveyed, they were not caught, they were not arrested. They made a lot of money from the drug trade, and they moved into positions as lawyers, as doctors, as businessmen, and moved out of it. And that was not the experience of the drug dealers from the public housing, who were always and constantly running from the police, constantly, and all of them had ended up getting criminal record. That's a more severe crime, drug trafficking. But if we look down that line, we see the same thing.
Hi, can I jump in on this?
Absolutely. You get the last word, Marlene, because we are at 5 o'clock,
Okay.
and you get the last word. I see there's so much more to talk about, but please go ahead.
I think the best example is what recently happened in United States, the armed insurrection of Capitol, US Capitol Hill, by overwhelmingly white people, many of them middle class, but ultra conservative, armed, and yet the intelligence services underestimated because they weren't paying attention. One, why? Because they were white. Many of the police officers on site, we have video of them shaking hands, taking selfies with armed insurrectionists, and then compare that to police law enforcement response when Black Lives Matter demonstrations have taken place across the United States, and they're there fully armed. They've got the metal barriers, they've got everything. That's the example of how now I'm getting too excited and my voice is going up and I'm going to hear my daughter yelling, lower your voice. That's an example of how the institution itself has to change.
Thanks, Marlene. And I think I overlooked Philippe. Did you have your hand up earlier? Philippe André?
Oh, way earlier. It's like too late now in the game. So, and I see the clock ticking. So,
So look, I know we didn't get the chance to get to all the questions, and there were some specific questions for many of you that I would like to come back to you with, so we can provide written responses to the people who were here and didn't have the chance to have their questions addressed. So we are going to be in contact with all of you in that regard. And for those of you who had hands up and I didn't see you, I apologize. I'd like to thank everybody. This has been an incredible conversation, and I feel like in the last hour we could have actually had a conversation for about another 2. I really would have liked to have seen more of that conversation, especially Anne-Marie and Fatty. I just and Kanika, that coming out of the box and looking at the institution as a whole, I just think is so fundamental, and thinking about the balance of reform, really fundamental. But Giza, it's wonderful to see your face here and for you to be back into the discussion. I just wanted to thank you for your courage in being with us, but not just to share a story, but also to think about how we fix things. And I think that the importance of people having voices, not just in telling stories, but in talking and translating their lived experience into solutions. So I want to thank everybody who is here. Again, thanks to all the people who are organizing with me. Thanks to Alain, who chaired the last session, to Marlene, who's just played such a tremendous leadership role for me and for the entire group throughout the entire process. Fatty, it was brave of you to come in this group. It was brave of you to come in this group. Majiza, such a pleasure, such an honor to get to meet you. Thank you to everybody who participated. Thanks to all the folks who stayed on with us until the end. I know it was a bit of a long haul. Philippe André Tessier, having your leadership here in Quebec and seeing the progress that the Quebec Commission has been making, such a welcome development. So nice to see you guys in the news for the right reasons recently. So thanks to everybody. Be well, be safe, get your vaccines, and we'll meet you soon. Take good care. Merci tout le monde.